In general, I found it to be surprisingly difficult to thoroughly explore music from countries outside of the main English-speaking market that I'm accustomed to. Occasionally I've stumbled upon a singular artist from elsewhere that grabs my attention, but that alone never fully opened the door to their country's music in general. Pretty quickly, a dead end comes after that. In contrast, I'd grown very used to just how easy it was to keep moving through English music when I was initially exploring different decades of it. The evolution, mythology, and influences of rock and pop music from the 50s to probably about the early 2000s is clear-cut. The pillar albums of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, who each artist was influenced by, who their work ended up influencing in turn. The whole music family tree for that era is so well established that you can practically jump in, start at any point, and have no shortages of branches to follow to discover new stuff from there. Like if you're a teenager who just found out who Nirvana is and want to find similar bands to listen to, then it doesn't take a lot of searching to find out that their contemporaries at the time are Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, or that their drummer went on to form Foo Fighters, or that Nirvana directly influenced mid-90s rock bands like Weezer or the post-grunge scene, or that Nirvana themselves were influenced by bands like Pixies, Dinosaur Jr., the underground 80s scene in general. It's so easy to expand outward from a single point. But coming from that American perspective into other countries' music, it felt a lot choppier. And for a while this was even the case with Japan, which was probably the country outside of my main musical orbit that I would get exposed to the most, largely through anime openings that are more often than not great songs. Finding branches to follow from any of those songs, however, was touch and go. If you keep digging, of course you will eventually find stuff to sink your teeth into, but that took a lot longer than I'd prefer. Even now in the internet age, yeah, you have some essentials charts from 4chan or some videos that talk about a single artist in isolation, but the sources on where to start and where to move on to from there, especially one that informs you more than this, that just lists 40 albums and leaves it at that, felt pretty scarce. Surprisingly though, that lack of a well-established musical canon is even somewhat the case from a Japanese perspective. From reading the book Quit Your Band by Ian F. Martin, he explains that music in Japan was viewed differently from other art like literature. There wasn't as much of a culture of criticism there. Having outright negative reviews was seen as taboo, and when that type of music discussion gets homogenized, it lessens the ability to highlight and lift up works positively. It wasn't until 2007 that a magazine, Rolling Stone Japan, broke an unspoken rule and actually ranked what they consider the top 100 Japanese albums of all time, causing a few others to eventually follow and only then start to carve out the main pillars of the country's music. So that's part of why its musical trajectory isn't as clear-cut as the English rock canon. And beyond that, there's also the fact that Japanese artists were often partially influenced by Western ones, so it isn't as self-contained. From an American perspective, we don't feel much of them crossing over with us. And the thing about that is, yeah, they don't need to cross over. Behind the US, Japan has the largest music industry in the world, and their market is notably different from most others in that a large sum of their profit still comes from physical media. Like, look at CDs. They're everywhere in Japan. They even still release singles on CDs. Like, when's the last time that was common in the US? A few factors beyond that are how bands could often be lumped into the expectation that a band being from Japan just means they're kooky, high energy, and weird by Western standards. Sometimes a band that does manage some crossover did so because they don't necessarily fit into a Japanese scene, and in that way don't end up connecting fans to other artists. A lot of notable Japanese artists were only added to streaming services in recent years. It's not like a ton of acts tour the US or that they're marketed here either, which again, as unfortunate as it is pretty understandable since it would just be a waste, probably. Especially with touring, it's tough for them to do all that traveling and manage to break even in the US, because while Western music often influences musicians in Japan, that feeling generally isn't reciprocated. I mean, it was only a few years ago that the Oscars realized a foreign film can deserve awards outside of its own category, and it's not too different with foreign language music as a whole. Until the sudden surge in popularity of K-pop around 2018 or so, there were only 16 songs that were predominantly in a different language to even reach the Billboard Top 10 in the US, only one of which was Japanese back in 1963. It's not an easy market to break into from the outside. So, where to start and where to go wasn't exactly served on a silver platter. Having an anime opening that I really loved did not exactly open the doors to explore several genres with confidence. It took a while, and I wish that initial process was a lot faster because there is absolutely no shortage of great artists here. So, what we're going to do is chronologically go through 11 albums that touch on a different genre and era, talk about that album, the artist, their style, all that jazz, which may even include some jazz. This will by no means be a comprehensive history of Japanese music. I'm simply not that knowledgeable. It's just several suggested entry points laid out, organized, and explained, all in one place. So let's start it off with An extremely notable figure in Japanese music, a lot of people say that Haruomi Hosono is the Japanese Brian Wilson. But at least in terms of his overall career, I think he's a bit more like Paul McCartney. The first landmark of Hosono's career is his time as the bassist and one of the singers for the band Happy End in the late 60s, early 70s. That was a time when it was being debated whether rock music should be sung in Japanese at all, or only in English as its mother tongue. Interestingly, kind of similar to the idea of cultural appropriation in more current discussions. Happy End was one of the early notable bands to push against that idea and also mold the language in a way to fit more with rock music. Japanese is more syllabic and rigid, like, for example in English singing, we can elongate or scrunch up words without changing the meaning. But in Japanese, say, a to sound can mean one thing, but extending it slightly makes it to, which can mean something else. From what I understand, those seem to be the type of issues with the language in rock music rhythms, where there wasn't as much vocal wiggle room as in, say, jazz. And what Happy End did about that was have each beat be one syllable. Vocals match up more closely to the main rhythms than elsewhere. They're usually said to be the first rock band to sing entirely in Japanese, which was controversial at the time, but then with them releasing 2 more well-received Japanese language albums before breaking up, the doors were fully open for other bands to do the same. That combined with their connection to the early seeds of city pop genre development, and the fact that their 3 albums are just, really good, earned them importance that often places them as a Japanese equivalent to, Paul McCartney's band, the Battles, or whoever they were. Hosono's solo work afterwards showcases more of a stylistic range that connects him even more to Paul. Paul would jump from sound to sound, where he could have the big ballad in Hey Jude, the country track Rocky Raccoon, proto-metal Helter Skelter, kinda sweet and sappy Bluebird, and eventually even develop interest in electronic music with Temporary Secretary and the duo known as Fireman that he released a few albums with. Hosono adds a similar amount of variety to his catalog before the 70s end. He gets in his first solo release that's folky with stripped-down production, much like McCartney 1, with some Ram vibes too. Other releases toyed with more psychedelic sound, jazz fusion, some avant-garde. And later in the 70s, he started Yellow Magic Orchestra, which is yet another popular band of his that has a notable role in the early development of a genre, this time with the rising popularity of synth-pop and electronic music. So that kinda connects to Paul's dips into electronica, and also the fact that given Paul had wings, they both managed to have a second successful band within a decade of their first one breaking up. Hosono gets a bit more abstract after that, while Paul still has his pop tendencies. But neither box themselves in, they both collaborate with other musicians often, and still to this day haven't stopped making their own music. So with Hosono, there's not a particular album that's going to sum up a career like that. My personal recommendation will just be his initial solo album, Hosono House, which was released in the, I don't know, it's hard to say when this was, I don't know. It's a very cozy, laid-back take on the Western Americana sound of that era. You can hear some Jim Croce in there, and Hosono has specifically said that James Taylor and the band's sounds were big influences. The actual Hosono house that the album takes its name from is basically an equivalent to Big Pink, where the band recorded their debut album. Especially if you're already a fan of that era and sound in Western music, it's really interesting to hear this and see that this record hidden from you on the other side of the world for however long can easily slot in and match up with these other records that you've known for years. It's a comforting Japanese take on Sunday morning, sitting on your porch, looking out your back door, rock-tinged country music. And from there you can be eased into his later style, since a few years ago he actually remade the album as Hosono House, taking all the songs and blending them with the eccentricities that he adopted throughout his career. If you prefer the original, then stick with his early solo stuff, Happy End, and what the other members went on to do. Or for a more modern band with some of those folk sounds, maybe Nagisa ni Te. But otherwise you can move forward to his time with Yellow Magic Orchestra and whatever other weird stuff he messed around with. I like my jazz the way I like my 1947 Tom and Jerry animated short, The Cat Concerto, with a lot of piano in it. So get out of here Miles Davis with your trumpet, I don't care about Charles Mingus and his bass, or John Coltrane with his saxophone. We're looking at Ryo Fukui making piano-led jazz, perfectly fitting that late-at-night quiet barroom feel, hearing him delightfully dance across the keys in his self-taught style, being able to seamlessly change moods in an instant. Scenery, his first of only a few records, is entirely instrumental, split about 60-40 between the slower reserve sound and the more up-tempo stuff. And the band he plays with here only consists of himself, his brother on drums, and a bassist, and all 3 of those parts are compelling. Works great as background music while also being engaging if you want to listen closer to it. Apparently people who are real jazz heads aren't that high on it, so if you want to fit in with them, maybe try Jiro Inagaki instead, he's pretty cool. But obviously just decide on it for yourself. It's an album that speaks for itself pretty immediately. There's a reason it was able to catch on in the YouTube algorithm and go from being fairly unknown outside of Japan to an internet favorite. Most of us only have 10-second long attention spans now anyways, but those first 10 seconds are pretty much all you need to see whether or not his style is going to click with you. When looking at music genres whose core was more or less created in Japan, city pop is probably one of the first ones you'll come across. And defining genres is tough, ultimately they're just labels that don't matter. So here if you see, the tag simply referred to music that projected an urban feel and whose target demographic was urbanites. Many of the artists did not embrace the Japanese influences of their predecessors and instead largely drew from American soft rock, boogie, and funk. Some examples may also include tropical flourishes or elements taken from disco, jazz fusion, Okinawan, Latin, and Caribbean music. Screw that, forget it all, who cares? All you need to know is that this is city pop. Taeko Ohnuki's Sunshower. It's a joyful, regardless of what the actual lyrics are saying, smooth stroll of an album with music that sounds like it belongs in the cloud level of a Super Nintendo game. And fun fact, she actually sings a song on the Mother 3 soundtrack. Really lovely harmonies in the background of the album. The keys are used effectively to buoy everything else up, and those are actually played by one of the many collaborators of the record, Ryuichi Sakamoto, who's a pretty recognizable name in Japanese music. Really overall, Sunshower is a bit of a melting pot of people who, looking back, are important figures for that era. Obviously, Ohnuki herself is influential within J-pop and city pop. You got Sakamoto, who's done a million things, from his solo work to soundtracks to later being in Yellow Magic Orchestra with Hosono, who also appears on this record playing bass. And finally, Ohnuki's former bandmate, the coolest man on the planet, sometimes called Tatsuro Yamashita, who between his work with that band Sugar Babe, his solo albums, his time arranging songs with Maria Takeuchi, and whatever the hell else he's done, is arguably the most notable figure within city pop, and also is on this record. So, on its own, Sunshower is already strong. Ohnuki's voice is very soothing throughout, soaring so well on something like the opener, Summer Connection. The drumming has a sort of jazz-tinged fluidity put into a more pop-structured song, fairly Steely Dan-esque in that aspect, especially on the track Law of Nature. And the arrangements as a whole are maybe not a full wall of sound, but like 3/4 of a wall of sound. There's a lot of little quirks, little pet sounds, where you could be listening to a song for the 50th time and notice something you hadn't heard before. An excellent record that doubles as an easy launching pad to other albums of this era. Fantasma is like, you know that episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns takes control of every TV station and keeps appearing on whatever channel you flip to?
Yeah.
Fantasma is like if this guy, Keigo Yamada, aka Cornelius, was jumping between every single radio station like that. After being in Tokyo and forming the band Flipper's Guitar in the late 80s with musician Kenji Ozawa, and creating the foundation for a genre known as shibuya-kei, a sort of bubbly, light music, indie pop style that's free to mix and match other direct influences very openly, he went on to build up refining that range of influences until he reached his finest work with this album in '98. The range of sounds isn't to a near-jarring level like in a band like Ween where they'd have a full-on country song, a spoken word track, and a song that sounds like Motorhead and so on. Most of what's on Fantasma sounds like it's coming from the same distinct place due to the production style and Oyamada's voice. But within that, it still has a lot of variation throughout the album and even several times drastically adjusts its style within the same song. Mike Check has pieces of chill lo-fi beat, there's slightly softened punk energy on the track New Music Machine. Count 5 or 6's main vocals are robotic. Chapter 8, Seashore and Horizon, is a hell of an Elliott Smith parody, intentional or not. 2010 would be at home on an NES game, etc. And what connects it all is that thrown throughout the album are these sound bites reminiscent of the different ways somebody would discover music. Radio fuzz when searching through channels, the sound of closing a cassette player, a CD player, applause from the audience before the performer plays their next song. It's a varied, yet through that, cohesive love letter to the experience of being a music fan. So grab a good pair of headphones and listen to it straight through. It's rare that, in addition to an album just sounding great and managing to stay in your brain after going in your ear, it also has a compelling story that was happening around it and ends up adding more emotional weight. For the reggae dream pop band Fishmans, this was sadly the case with their final live album, and overall final proper performance ever, 98-12-28. It was meant to merely be the end of the band's first era, since while their bassist, Yuzuru Kashiwabara, was departing after 11 years with the band, Fishmans was planning to continue on afterwards. What then happened was that a few months later, the band's frontman, Shinji Sato, suddenly passed away, reportedly from a heart failure. so the concert that was known to be a goodbye for one person ended up being a farewell for a lot more. The tragedy of it enhances how you might be affected by the music, the mood, Sato's singing, but regardless, the 2-hour-long performance was already an incredible culmination of their entire body of work, somehow playing all of these great songs better than they ever sounded in the studio. Off the top of my head, there are few records that sound quite this good sonically. The guitar and vocals especially ring out perfectly throughout the huge room, with all that space letting the intimate tracks be lonelier, the high energy points punch harder, and the long, expansive tracks properly and wonderfully overwhelm you in their scale. It's a sound that absorbs you so well that, as much as I like their studio records, their production feels flat in comparison to this. It's production that's practically begging to be heard through the best speakers you have. And what you'd hear there is the reggae dub-style stuff from their early years in a song like Ikoki, to a blend of that and dream pop in these soothingly somber moments like the track Night Cruising, which is so emotionally effective that it tricks you into thinking you actually understand the words he's saying, or even some elements of prog or psychedelia with their 40-plus minute closer to the performance, Long Season. Every single different side of Fishmans is worth a chance, and it just makes you wonder how else they would have expanded if they went on from here. In the 90s Japanese underground scene, there are 3 particular bands at the forefront who influenced many to come. Supercar, Kuruli, and this one here, Number Girl. Consisting of Shutoku Mukai, Hisako Tabuchi, Kentaro Nakao, and Ahito Inazawa, it was an initial 7-year-long career filled with waves of aggressive guitar riffs, booming drums, fuzzy bass lines, and the type of unintelligible singing that makes you wonder how this guy's throat is still in one piece at the end of every album. It's a sound that you have to work through. Behind all that angst, noise, and distortion, these 4 people are trying to hide the fact that they know damn well how to write a melody. Number Girl can get a chorus stuck in your head for as long as anybody else. It's just not going to be an instant reaction. So we're going to talk about their second album here, Schoolgirl Distortional Addict. My personal experience with the album is not so coincidentally similar to my experience with one of the band's main influences, Husker Du, and their first big album, Zen Arcade. They're both so raw and fuzzy that, especially if you aren't already familiar with punk hardcore bands, it can all sound kinda samey initially, like, yeah, there's another crazy fast drum beat paired with the unending noise riffs and some voice buried far below all of it. But all it took was eventually noticing one of the songs and thinking, wait a minute, let's take a closer listen to that voice here. So you pull that vocal melody out of the fuzz it was hidden in, and with that the rest of the song reveals itself, which in turn unlocks the rest of the album, and for a long time after that, each time you hear the album, you like it even more. It really does feel like they're trying to hide one of their main strengths, so you gotta dig it up. Most punk bands have their vocalist with an already powerful voice pushed up to the front of the mix, but with Number Girl, even though the overall distortion and noise is a bit lessened here compared to their first album, Shutoku Mukai still sounds like he's in the back. His voice naturally feels a little more thin and frail than average, so it's like a voice truly stretching itself beyond its limits, fighting tooth and nail to be heard above the instruments that it should be drowning in, which, if not compelling enough on its own, probably adds an effect to the angst of their lyrics. Overall, it's a very intense, gripping, tight album that, while perhaps overpowering at first, displays some really excellent instrumentals from each member of the band, and those members do also show to have more range and tempo and style than the average indie hardcore band may. It's widely considered to be their best album, but none of the 4 released during their initial run are pushed to the side. So if you want an even quicker taste, I'd actually suggest watching a video from 2002 of the last song from their last concert. Even more so than with Fishmans, this was known as a definitive end to Number Girl at the time. The bassist was leaving, and the other members were calling it quits. And so throughout this performance, as they're singing Omoide in my head, or Memories in my head, that's all fully hitting the crowd. If anything from them is going to hit right near instantly, it's that. It's an obvious thing to say, but I only say it because it's true. Nujabes really is the ultimate chill beats to relax/study to. It's just also the best chill beats to drive to, cook to, do your taxes to, the list goes on. Despite having a relatively short career, as his first full album came out in 2003 and he sadly died in a traffic accident only 7 years later, he had created and near perfectly refined the style of chill, comforting hip-hop that I still don't think anybody else has reached the same heights with, at least as far as I know. And with Nujabes, all of his proper albums, be it 2003's Metaphorical Music, 2005's Modal Soul, or the Samurai Champloo soundtrack, they're all such confident-sounding records that it's hard to imagine how he got to that point. But what showcases a little of his evolution getting there is a series of songs, Lovesick, that he made over the course of his career with rapper Shingo 2. If you listen to the very first Lovesick, it's suddenly very obvious that his style is just the intentional clash of either smooth jazz piano melodies or horns, with the rougher sound of record scratch-riddled vocal samples and more traditional, rough 90s hip-hop style drum beats. If you hear specifically the beat on that track and how it's produced, it's not that far off of something like Wu-Tang. So in a way, it's a simple recipe, and one that wasn't totally unheard of in Western hip-hop or other Japanese artists like DJ Crush, who has some great work. However, with Nujabes, as you go through to Lovesick Parts 2 and 3, the line between those aspects effectively blurs. His jazz arrangements became more layered, rather than having just one of either the piano or horns on stage at a time. The vocal samples are utilized more rhythmically, and the drum beats, especially the bass drum, are ever so slightly softer. They still contrast each other, but now it feels less like they came from completely different places. They belong to the same small world, this environment that Nujabes created. And that's a place where music from anywhere can find a spot to comfortably fit into. As you go through his other albums, there will be sample references from Brazil, Japan, America, Italy, England, France, with some of his selections still being so obscure that you can hardly find any information on the artist. And that's because Nujabes, in addition to being a DJ, producer, and composer, he also owned his own record label, working with similar artists like Uyama Hiroto, and owned 2 record stores in Shibuya. The guy was clearly as big of a music fan as anybody could imagine. He lived and breathed this stuff. And in absorbing so much of it, he turned it all into a sound that comes out of the speakers and consumes the whole room it's played in. All of his work is excellent. Even with the amount of different MCs he collaborated with, they all fit the flow needed well. Of them, his first album, Metaphorical Music, edges out the rest for me. The production's particularly immaculate, and I think it's probably his best beats overall, but you can't really go wrong with any of his releases. Out of everyone in this video, he's the one who I'd most confidently recommend to somebody regardless of what their general music taste is. Anybody would get sucked into this world, and if they somehow don't, then I don't trust them. One band in the running for my personal favorite here is Asian Kung Fu Generation. For anybody who's trying to get into J-Rock especially, a genre in which there's absolutely no shortage of great acts from Ringo Shina, to The Pillows, to Fuji Fabric, to Chatmonchi, to others, these guys are probably going to be one of the first bands you see mentioned often enough to give a shot, and if you watch anime, then odds are you've heard some of their songs already. They've been around for over 20 years, have had no lineup changes, found success fairly early, and have never strayed too far from their bread and butter of slick guitar hooks and catchy, passionate choruses. They're one of those bands where, at least to me, they don't just have 1 or 2 albums that stand clear above the rest. Which one of their albums is my favorite has changed multiple times, and any of those would be solid recommendations. But of them, we'll go with their 3rd album, Fanclub, which offers a bit more spread musically of fast-paced, constantly surging forward riff-based rock. Here they wear their love of 90s Western rock music on their sleeve, the loud, quiet, loud dynamics, the occasional semisonic tinge, that riff that's like a cooler version of Lit's My Own Worst Enemy. It's all taken in, tightened up, and made their own, with songs that showcase well what each member is capable of. Masafumi Goto's jumps from talk singing to an almost scream is even wider than they were on Solfa. Nowadays his voice notably has less range, but man, when he had it, he used it about as well as you could. His role in the powerful chorus of World Apart is a clear highlight. The lead single, Blue Train, this smooth, driving alt-rock track that effectively gives off a mellow, lonely optimism, also just happens to have an absolutely stellar display of drumming. Kiyoshi Ajichi's drum part manages to be so all over the place, keeping you on your toes with such clearly impressive speed and precision. The drum part has so many distinct sections, but they all somehow act in service to the song as a whole instead of just being a chance for him to show off. Like seriously, if you're a drummer, you owe it to yourself to listen to Fanclub for Ajichi alone, because this is him at his best. And that's very arguably the case for the band as a whole here. They march in with waltz and codebook calmly and confidently, taking time building up to their usual pace that was so cleanly refined on Solfa. World Apart is these dribbling riffs that inject energy straight into you. Tightrope compresses every longing, nostalgic feeling you've ever had into a single guitar lick. Sakura So's bass line pulls it forward so well. And like, Blue Train is on this record. Did I mention how good Blue Train is? Just so good! It's so good! For accessible J-rock, they're a clear pick to start with for a reason. Plus these guys are diehard Weezer fans, so you know they're cool. And even their album art is consistent and great, all being done by Yusuke Nakamura from Tatami Galaxy and stuff. Like, what more do you want? This is Game, Perfume's debut album, and their strongest perhaps in large part because they have been building up to it for over 8 years. Consisting of Ayano Omoto, Yuka Kashino, and Ayaka Nishiwaka, all three of them had attended the same talent academy and debuted the group in Hiroshima in 2002, when they were just teenagers. A few years later, they partnered up with producer and DJ Yasutaka Nakata, who's essentially the fourth member of the group, as he's written the music and lyrics for all their albums and is who steered the girls towards the technopop style that they mostly weren't aware of prior to working with him. So that collaboration starts in 2003, and Perfume drops a good amount of singles from there, but Game, their first proper album, doesn't come out until 2008. So with that long of a wait, and the last full 2 of those years being spent working directly on the album, Game skips over the more unstable early sound of a group still figuring itself out, and jumps straight into being 12 smooth-feeling, musically catchy electronic-based pop songs. And because it was a pretty instant success that would clearly have influence, the style they presented with the appearance aspects of an idol group blended heavily with electronica and synth was being called future pop at the time, which now in recent years the group has said turned out to be more true than they expected. For a Western comparison, the first to come to mind is Daft Punk on their catchier tracks. Definitely notable overlap between them musically, with the main differences Perfume offers being, besides a trio of women vocalists, being that their sound on average is a bit more out in front, or like aggressively danceable, I guess. Like with a lot of Daft Punk, yeah, you can dance to it, but I could also turn it on in the background while I read a book. Perfume on this record don't often have that gear in them, so mileage may vary on them, but certainly worth a try, especially if some level of electronica is already in your wheelhouse. They showcase that there's more stylistic range to idol groups than most would probably think. There can be plenty down the line of more standard bubblegummy J-pop, some that lean more pop rock, and techno-leaning ones like here. So between that, the music itself, the choreography, music videos, and very visually impressive stage shows, or just the really weird outfits, most people can find something to appreciate in the huge collaboration that is Perfume. So Tricot, I only learned that they weren't pronounced as Tricot when researching for this video, are a quartet who've been kicking around for over 10 years and their sound largely revolves around math rock. Which,
What is math rock? You know people say genres out loud, and I just think, you're just lying.
I definitely don't trust myself to explain it well, but like, if the music you hear has a lot of starts and stops, and the rhythm is kind of sporadic and feeling unpredictable, then it's probably math rock. With Tricot, on their first album, that sporadicness applies to the general musicality as well as their volume, which they can also change on a dime easily, and do so without feeling as formulaic as Loud Quiet Loud. When you hear something like that, you think, yep, that's the Pixies Nirvana thing. And I love those guys in a lot of songs with that overlapping style, but with Tricot, when they go from and quickly shift over to that only feels like Tricot. They have this intensity that's fully shown when everything lets loose and there's not a second of silence in the mix, but when they quiet down you can still feel that same energy simmering in there, just pulled back behind the sweeter, more welcoming side of them. That aspect I'd have to credit most to the vocalist, who performs that very breathy style super well. For the album as a whole though, the main highlight are the guitars. Every single one of those scratchy, angular riffs is memorable, and the production on them is so crisp, I couldn't imagine them any other way. They're probably an especially good recommendation if you're a musician, but the hooks are there for anyone, and their career as a whole is rather consistent so far. But this album is particularly well structured in having that aforementioned back and forth intensity for so long that it ends up as a shock when they can then cool you off so effectively with one of the last tracks that manages to actually match American football levels of contemplative, sad relaxation. That ends up as a well-structured, rewarding listen from a band that feels like they're putting all of themselves into every single song. Mass of the Fermenting Dregs are probably the least notable or unique artist of all the ones talked about here, but I just think they're neat. Led by frontwoman Natsuko Miyamoto, they formed in 2002 creating a blend of the high ferocity and pounding rhythms of post-hardcore, the sonic fog of shoegaze, and the strong melodies of J-rock. But somehow with a sound as cool as that, they just ended up kicking around for a while, only releasing one proper album and a handful of singles and EPs until breaking up in 2012. Thankfully though, Miyamoto revived the name a few years later and pulled it out of the ground stronger than ever when they released 2018's No New World, an upbeat, tight, 27-minute long guitar-driven rock record that lessens the shoegaze aspects of their sound, instead balancing their hardcore and J-rock sides well. It has this crisper, clean production that especially benefits the guitars. But the performances still contain a surplus of that punk energy. The end of the song, If Only, practically feels like all the instruments are racing each other to the end, and only by chance do they stay together in rhythm throughout. The short follow-up to it, Ya Ya Ya, is a complete explosion without words. Only when they've gone that far can they then drop all the way back down with a calmer, more sensitive title track. He nails every sound from those two sides to the mid-tempo rock in between. And again, I don't know what the lyrics mean, not even gonna look it up, but the album, and I suppose Miyamoto's voice in particular, sounds positive. It feels very kind to me, and that's something to really appreciate. The record's not as important as all the others, there's not a big story to it, it's not particularly complex. Sadly, all it is great. So, yeah, that's that. 11 albums I truly think are fully worthwhile by artists that touch on a multitude of eras and styles within Japan's long musical history. Obviously, there are plenty more areas you could go into. There are rabbit holes for shoegaze, standard J-pop, noise rock, who knows what else. But this is what I got for you. It's hopefully enough to absorb, find an entry point, and end up deep enough in that you'll be able to keep discovering artists beyond this without even trying. Enjoy.